All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Ben Stewart Podcast. I have a very special guest. And this time, when I say that, I know usually it's because, like, oh, I've been trying to get this person, or this is somebody I've been reading for quite some time. This specific guest is one of the smartest people I know. And he is my brother-in-law. I actually met him at the same exact time that I met my wife, Barbara, in Amsterdam at a talk I was giving. And at that time, I honestly, even up until now, knew very little about the specific tidbits of history that Ruben was feeding my way. His name is Ruben Mol, and he was feeding my way for quite some time until last week when Gordon and I did, because last week on that exact day, on Thursday, something broke out in Ukraine. And Gordon and we talked about what are the circulating narratives? What can we talk about here that isn't just hyper focusing on we have the conclusions, let's just ask a bunch of questions. And Ruben connected with me afterwards and said, please let me fill in the blanks for you. There's a lot that you haven't touched upon. And I jumped at the opportunity. I've been wanting to get Ruben on this podcast, and it's not just about history that we're going to be talking about. It's not just about the Russia-Ukraine crisis that we're seeing happening right now. It's about peeling back the layers and really looking at deeper levels of explanation of what this all means to begin with. So I like how Russell Brand says it. Opening up the conversation is not condoning anything. And there's a filmmaker that he also quoted who said, tyranny is the forced removal of nuance. So let's not step down that road and just ban away different ideas that could potentially help us understand what's happening in the world a little bit deeper. I'm super excited about this one, so let's get straight to it on the Ben Stewart Podcast. And we're back. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us again. We're doing this live earlier in the day because our guest, my brother-in-law, Ruben Mol, is in Amsterdam, or at least south of Amsterdam in Holland right now, and it is later in the day for him. So this is how we had to make it work. We got everything good?
His connection, right as we said that, I think his connection's just had a little spotty. He might come back in a second.
I think I see him.
We're good.
Skype. All right, Ruben, my man, how you doing today?
Yeah, great, Ben. Thanks for having me, as they always say so nicely in America.
Yes. Yeah, man. And we will have much more of you. Actually, this is a very special episode because you are going to be our first behind the paywall exclusive podcast content at benjosephstewart.com. So in the exclusive content, not everybody has to listen to my voice ad nauseum over and over again. We're going to start getting some new voices, and I'm really excited that you'll be the first voice other than my own behind the paywall. So that's going to be really cool. So what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that we will do the YouTube portion of this, and then for the stuff that YouTube overlords, as we like to say, or just the happy people in San Francisco that monitor these things, that they don't appreciate on their platform, and we are going to respect that, and we're going to say it somewhere else for exclusive members. So with that being said, Ruben, yeah, we've known each other since October 2012, and it's been a long journey, man. And I know you've been looking into what we're going to talk about today for the past 20 years at least. And when you saw that podcast last week with Gordon and I'm really glad that you reached out. What would you say is the number one thing that you were hoping you would have heard in that podcast that you really want to dive deeper into today?
Well, there's so many things to talk about, so it's kind of, the number one thing I would say is the image of expansion-oriented Soviet Union, because it's not really funded in reality.
So like the whole idea of like Russian imperialism expanding that idea and that narrative to try and paint one boogeyman and then the saviors coming to the rescue to kind of like balance that narrative.
Yeah, the good guy, bad guy narrative. Russians being the bad guys, because as we will get into, there's not much to be found in the entire known history of Russia that would make them aggressive in any sense or way. Of course, there's enough to be found, as we know, for the US and its NATO allies and previous history, where the Western world can be seen as quite invasive.
Yeah. Just saying hello to the chat in here. So, so the narrative, like, there's a lot of things going on around this whole situation right now. And as I posted that, I had a lot of people saying, like, do you know that some of the most fertile soil is in Ukraine? Do you realize that there's a lot of mining for neon and plutonium and uranium? And I didn't even realize until recently, actually, that Chernobyl is in Ukraine. And it was just within the past week that I think Russia recaptured Chernobyl, the site, that famous site. What do you think? I mean, like, I know you can't put it succinctly, and I would say just go as long as you need, but what do you think are the main drivers that leads us to February 24th or 22nd? February 22nd, I think it was. What are the main drivers that leads us here to this point?
Well, this can take it as far back as we want to, but Russia has seen NATO coming closer and closer in 5 or 6 different waves. And actually, the way NATO started out already, directly after the Second World War, well, not directly, but about 10 years after that, Germany joined NATO. And of course, previous to that, Germany and the Soviet Union had been in a massive war, the most horrible thing we ever saw on Earth. About 11 million Russian soldiers or Soviet soldiers died in that war, alongside 20 million or 30 million civilians. So to include Germany in an anti-Soviet alliance is already a sign of hostility in a way, with that kind of a sensitive history. Like 80% of all the boys that were 17 years old when the Second World War started in Russia perished in that war. Just to give you guys a kind of idea of how massive that is. Like 90% of the Second World War was between the Soviet Union and Germany. The United States entered the war in 1942, when basically the Germans were already defeated for the biggest part. And yet we learn in our history that the Americans saved us here in Western Europe, and we hear very little about the Soviet effort. So that's how this NATO story starts. And then we see a promise after the Soviet Union collapsed, and it didn't really collapse, it was actually disbanded from within, because there was a realization of the Russians that if they would stay on the path of imperialism, well, not really imperialism, but a kind of massive powerhouse polarized against another powerhouse, it would lead to future confrontation, and with nuclear weapons, I mean, probably or possibly destruction of the world, so no one would benefit. And this is the main reason why the Russians decided, I think it was in 1985, to break up the Soviet Union, and they assisted the ex-Soviet Union states to become independent from them. And there was a promise from NATO that they would not expand to the east. This is not written down, but it was verbally given to them. Yet NATO, of course, went further to the east, all the way to Ukraine now. They try. So in 2008, NATO declared, we are going to get Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. And there's nothing that we will listen to. So the Russians said that's not going to happen. And then the Georgian war happened, which was basically, again, a provocation by the Georgian government, or most likely CIA. CIA in Georgia. And with this provocation, which was, I think they shot a couple of thousand Russian people or something in South Ossetia, which is one of the independent little nations in the north of Georgia. And then the Russians came and basically stabilized the situation. So that was the Georgian war. And now we see a similar thing in Ukraine. By the way, what is very important to mention, I think, is the Bolshevik revolution as well. Is seen as a Russian revolution. But Trotsky and 600 other people likely were trained in New York to bring this spell of Marxism, communism to Russia. Because back then, Tsarist Russia was already opposing the creation of the Federal Reserve. So they were opposing a private banking system because they saw that that would threaten the security of the world and would turn into a slave system, basically. So there's a lot of history, and this is just a little bit of it. But already it becomes quite visible that they have anticipated this NATO offensive for quite a while. At least since Putin came in 2000, they have been trying to unify with the West. They even tried to join NATO. The US did not allow them.
Right.
Because they thought if we join them, there's no more danger. So that plan failed, along with many other attempts to bargain with them. So basically, there's a one-sided aggression, kind of globalist empire that uses NATO as a policing force, so to take out, of course, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other non-compliance. And in doing so, they train extremists, form their soldiers, their armies. So then we speak about the Chechen wars as well. In the 90s, they were financed by the West. They were a civil war in Russia, basically.
Mm-hmm.
ISIS is armed, most likely by the US. They say not on purpose,
Right.
like in Afghanistan.
They're just freedom fighters. We're just helping freedom. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, there's all these very nice Machiavellian terms they use. I'm curious, could you go a little bit deeper into when you talk about, because talking about like the Minsk agreements and diplomacy in the West, especially, there's a very sort of bipartisan, for the most part, perspective that Russia has been very much the bad faith actor in all of these sort of diplomatic discussions. They've never really tried to act in good faith, and NATO and the president of Ukraine and previous ones have always been acting very, like, it just seems like when you really look into it, I'm a little confused. Can you speak to, sort of just when they have these diplomatic talks, who is really being unrealistic and who's acting in good faith? Because when Ukraine really asks to be under NATO, is that really a realistic ask, knowing that that means they're under the nuclear umbrella? And everyone really, a lot of analysts said everyone always knew Ukraine was never going to be in NATO. That was a dream. That was a pipe dream. And it was unrealistic for them to ask. So, I think that's a big thing for the West to understand is like these diplomatic relations. It's really made out to be like Russia has just come to the table drunk on vodka and like, fuck you, we're not going to even try to make any negotiations. You're just all dumb and idiots. And we're just here to just be, aggressive and bear like Russians. And it just seems to be very, one, discriminatory to the Russian people, but also just it doesn't allow for Russians, like Russian people can't be nuanced. And Putin's never tried to be nuanced. And I'm not trying to apologize for a lot of Putin's actions, but I'm just saying, can you help us understand a little bit more of that angle of just when these talks occur and throughout recent history, who's really been, what's been going on there?
Well, the image we have of Putin is completely in the West is completely shaped by media. Our media is impenetrable for truth, it seems.
Right.
And anything in the last 22 years, basically since the first Chechen war, my attention was drawn to Russia because I thought like, what's happening there? Why are we supporting like Muslim extremists against Russians? What did they do? So the more I looked into it, the less I found. There's all these stories about poisoning with plutonium, this big castle that Putin is supposed to have, which is completely fake, basically. He doesn't have a house that costs hundreds of millions, I actually met people who were building on his real house years ago. And it was a completely organic, self-sustainable, local materials built kind of house. Also, if you see little documentaries that there are in Russia, my ex-girlfriend's Russian, so I saw a lot of that stuff. He makes his own herbal tea, and gets it from his own garden, from his own herbal garden, and swims outside in nature and goes horseback riding. Well, those pictures, of course, we know because
we've seen those, yeah.
That suited the narrative,
right? Yeah.
So and then there's this picture of him shooting a tiger. He's next to a tiger, and they told us that he killed the tiger, but actually he had the honor of sedating a Siberian tiger that needed to be relocated because he actually made sure that they had a bigger living space for the breeding program. So it's completely opposed. In Georgia there was a Dutch journalist supposedly killed by a cluster bomb by the Russians.
So this picture you're saying this tiger's just sedated and they claimed he killed it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Vladimir Putin's tiger devours a bear in Russia. Like, okay.
Yeah, I don't know what else is. Yeah. Some of the stuff I saw like 15 years ago or 10 years ago. I don't know anymore when I saw what. I just know what I saw. So, and the Georgia story also, like 2 weeks before that cluster bomb.
There's the
Russians
horseback riding.
Wanted, like the one on the bear is also fun,
Yeah, I mean, hey,
chopped him on the bear.
Yeah. So obviously, there's been a lot of propaganda on both sides. I think the key thing is
it's all lies. It's all lies. Like,
And so for you, what have you found to be mostly more the case or the truth when it comes to diplomacy? Like, is Putin acting completely in good faith? Has he been overly aggressive in that way? Is it America and NATO just completely being unreasonable? Where do you feel is the nuance that's missed?
There is no input from the Russian side into the conversation. They don't let it in. The West does not let it in.
Interesting.
The Russians are actually aware that we are in a kind of matrix situation, and they desire to help us. There is no aggressive narrative towards the West.
What do you mean by
really exist?
What do you mean by matrix situation? They know we're in a matrix situation because Putin has said some certain things that like we in the West are like, what does he mean by that? And certain people put our conspiracy hats on. Or like he says globalists. He says these leaders are and he's very vague a lot of times. But is that what you're kind of referring to? What do you mean by they know this matrix we're in?
Um, well, that of course, well, because of the Russian girlfriend I saw some of their television programs as well. You know, like kind of programming that their version of, well, I guess another kind of Matrix, but it's much more free, I would say, than the West that they give. So the programs speak about certain topics, and quite often they speak about the West, obviously, because they feel quite threatened. And if you see the little map that I gave you with the NATO bases spread all over, then you can see that they have a point. You know, that they really
right.
Yeah, they are surrounded basically by NATO bases. And for example, one little flag, it's a very small image that I see now, but one of those little flags is not necessarily one military base. Like in Germany, for example, there are 148 US military bases. So that one bigger flag in Germany represents 148 military bases. Okay. So it's huge. And then they're in Kazakhstan, you know, they're everywhere except for Ukraine, Belarus, you know. But the rest they took of these ex-Soviet.
I mean, it's all it's all the BRIC countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China. You know, the countries that still don't have major central, you know, as much central banking and, you know, petroleum. You know, we know most people who, you know, petrodollar, we know runs a lot of the world, and that's why this recent move by Putin is kind of. I was trying to understand, you know, is this dealing more with geopolitics? Is it more with the petroleum, the major pipeline through Ukraine? Is it dealing more with natural resources? Is this sheerly just like it had just gotten to a point and Putin's like enough is enough, and it was a combination of things? I mean,
can I just interject because I feel like I want to add to that question by a lot of people are talking about just very, very recent events, but if you look like even back before World War II, Napoleon was even saying like, you know, China is a sleeping giant, and, you know, had many thoughts on Russia. And from that, not just from that point, but if you look at it on that map, there's no side of Russia or China that America's not setting up military bases. If you look at the Hawaii is a very strategic, what they call Indo-Pacific Command Center, and we set up military bases there. And Clinton even said, "Sorry, we illegally took over over Hawaii," but nothing was done about it. And it seems like really, it's a chess game. And it's not, it's largely, the moves have gotten a little bit more dramatic, it seems, in the past 20 years, past couple decades. But it almost seems like the West has this extreme Russophobia. And it's always in the, like, no matter what, if like Clinton's trying to get in, it's Russia's the problem. If Trump's in, Russia's the problem. Doesn't matter who's in office, Russia is always the problem. Russian collusion, all this stuff. And to me, it looks like that U.S. and the West allied forces are basically in a chess move, setting up for checkmate around the East, around Russia and China. And it almost seems like Russia and China have this like, okay, what if Russia tried to start setting up Russian military bases everywhere? Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. What if China was going to start surrounding the United States, you know, with Chinese military bases? Do you think we would allow that? That's, to me, like, my question is, like, this seems like also a larger play than just NATO. NATO is just how we're seeing it play out in the last few chess moves. Am I kind of on base with that? Because it seems larger than just the past 20 years that we're talking about.
Well, one little clarification, and I'll give it right back to you, Ruben, is I'm not a fan of Trump, but Trump was one of the first presidents who really did start pushing back against China. And this idea of now, like, Russia's not the real concern, it's China, you know? And so, like, this is where it's concerning with, or the bigger player I'm looking at is China, and how China is acting towards Russia. Because it seems like China now is finally starting to be like, Russia, we don't really, it seems like they're starting to kind of back away from Russia. And if Russia loses China's backing, they're pretty much out in the wind. So speak, please, Ruben, to what Ben said, but also sort of the Russia-China dynamic and how you feel, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't believe that the aggression is necessarily aimed so much at China and Russia. Well, it is aimed at them, but I mean the NATO forces are not an American army. They are a kind of a zombie army, the way I see it, that is used to create a kind of world police force. And the way of thinking of even people like Trump is a way of thinking which Putin calls exceptionalism. Like to see yourself as the big power in the world, and therefore to see the other second biggest one or bigger one as a threat per definition, to start this dualistic kind of standoff, and militarize everything and use a kind of aggressive rhetoric and tell a narrative that is about staying on top. And this is what Putin is very much speaking out against in a very clear way, actually. And what he strives for is a multipolar world. That's what he calls it. And a multipolar world means that there's not one centralized government, which is basically satanic, the way I view it, because it's the externalization of unity into the material world. And therefore, a pyramid starts to form, and divide and rule starts to be the game. Bread and games also comes in then within the system, and this is what we in the West are very much in. And especially the Americans are very much brainwashed into a kind of superhero complex, where they believe that they're bringing freedom and democracy all over the world. And in the meantime, those good intentions, which I do believe is a strong point of the American people, are furthering this control system, this fear-based control system, this pyramid. And they are destroying nations. Like Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, bombed 7 nations.
Oh, yeah, drones bringing so much peace.
Yeah, and yet still with a big part of the Democrats. I mean, I don't even know what to call these people, but the sleepers, I would say.
They're more hawkish now. It's wild.
Popular, still popular, yeah, because they have this emotional charge. It's all about blaming the other, shaming the other, because if you don't, you have to look inside.
Right.
And when they would look inside, and this is also what Western Europe needs to do, they will find a fucking mess, really. Well, since Biden, between 3 and 10 million illegal immigrants have come into the United States, for example. And be aware that, 4% once took the whole American revolution on their shoulders, You don't need that many people to destabilize a country. And you already had 30 million illegals running around. And of course, these words are sensitive to those people who want to censor any kind of reasoning, basically. Because that's why people are taught to be offended, like the whole Black Lives Matter movement and the feminist movement of modern days. And it's all made to stop and clog the internal communication within our Western world. So I believe that the distraction towards Russia is just to have a common enemy, which has us looking outside. And in the meantime, all sorts of control mechanisms are installed in our own countries. Just like now, they are furthering this QR agenda and they are changing laws and they're doing all that. And all of a sudden, COVID is no topic anymore, It's all about Russia now. So they distract the attention mainly.
Yeah, a lot of divide and conquer distraction techniques. And when we say I mean, okay, Ben. I was just going to reference.
Well, I was just going to say for the audience, if you want to understand what he meant by the QR thing,
hit on that
quietly, recently, I forget how many states, but a bunch of states signed on to the QR vaccine passport thing. It's not a Biden mandate or a administration thing. It's actually private. And this, in many ways, makes it a bit more dangerous. They're saying, oh, but don't worry, it's voluntary as of right now. Like, right, all these things start in a very cute, sweet manner, and they keep moving into this direction. But why aren't we hearing about that? Oh, well, we're hearing about it because of this thing that's going on over in Eastern Europe. Like, sure, but still report on the news. I mean, we also didn't hear anything about Byron Bay and places in Australia, worst floods ever, almost like a third world country. We're not hearing about some of these things. And I have a sneaky suspicion that Byron Bay and several places in Australia are going to build back up with the smart grid. So beyond that, like I think that's also kind of what you're pointing towards, Ruben, is like, yes, there is this thing happening in Eastern Europe right now, but that doesn't mean business as usual isn't still continuing to flood in other parts of the world towards whatever this agenda is. And, we're made to feel stupid. Even really researched people like Jamie Wheel, when he talks about conspiracy theorists, he still has like a kindergarten level understanding of conspiracy theories, and he's calling it all apophenia. Like, he's just like, look, there's a real thing where your dopamine gets set off when you're connecting patterns, even if they're not patterns, connecting dots that don't deserve to be connected. It's all apophenia. And I'm like, that's one explanation to try and explain away everything. That's the same thing as saying all white people are like this or all Mexicans are like this. It's a blanket statement covering everything. So, I mean, what I was hearing as far as like what you were saying with the very agitated liberal left arguments around all these things is they're not willing to open up conversation. Ezra Klein from Vox.com, one of the most balanced, intelligent people I know, you get him talking about something like, well, who are the Nazis today? Who are the legitimate Nazis today? And you break it down to his base argument, it's white Republicans. And it's like, how can you be so balanced and so educated and you still fall into this idea that if you're white and you're a Republican, then you're a Nazi? And there's no getting through to this very well-read, educated, intelligent, balanced person on these triggering topics. So you're right, it clogs up critical thinking. And even just, can we have a conversation? No, ban them, cancel them. No conversation, ban them, cancel them.
And we know that's by design.
Why I'm glad, like I'm seeing in the chat, there's a lot of people who are saying like, thank you for letting this guy speak. We need a little bit more of this kind of truth here. So what were you going to say there, Gordon, before I cut you off?
Well, it's just, we know that it's by design, exactly as Ruben's speaking to. This is part of the tactics used by basically Central Intelligence Agency psychological operations, just weaponized on the masses, and to basically distract us, to fight one another, to not really understand the true facts, to use the mainstream media as an extension. Operation Mockingbird, look into Chomsky, manufacturing consent. This is something that we've known from day one when you really, really looked into Russiagate and try to look at it objectively, taking your partisan lenses off. It really just didn't hold ground. And now it's been completely exposed. But to me, that's why it's so bizarre when Putin actually sort of like gave them exactly what they wanted. Because I saw they were trying to, it seemed to be overly painting him in a negative light. But then him actually acting was just like, man, now you're going to justify them to say, oh, we told you so about so many things that clearly have been debunked about this sort of Russiagate narrative. And so to me, it seemed like Putin had found that it's worth it in some degree. And that's where I'm still haven't understood. But, when we talk about they, just hitting back real quick on that point of like, who are we talking about when we talk about they? And you look at who really dictates a lot of American foreign policy. You look at places like the Council on Foreign Relations, World Economic Forum, these kind of things, but especially CFR when it comes to wars. And you look at their board of directors, you look at the chairmans, where these people come from, Carlyle Group, BlackRock, Larry Fink. You've got people in the media like Lauren Jobs, Emerson Collective, The Atlantic, these major players, CNN, Fareed Zakaria, Margaret Albright. She's such a lovable person, towards kids. So clearly it just shows the ideology of people who really are power players of these, puppets in media and these kind of things. And we know they've been wanting a war with Russia. They've wanted a war in the Middle East. They want a war with Iran. And I don't know if they want a war as much with China because we have so much economic interest with our Wall Street elites. But Ruben, just speak to a little bit of, we know they want this. How do you think the Russian people and Putin, what are we missing? Like, how are they justifying this to them? And are they're saying they're not going to stay in Ukraine. What do you kind of see from their
perspective? They're telling the truth, basically. They're telling them the truth. They have been telling them the truth all along. They have been telling them NATO is coming to us. They're brainwashing the people there. They're putting them in their armies. They're placing rocket installations, which they call defensive weapons.
Right.
Which is not about the weapons themselves, but about the supposed intention. But defensive against whom? If they are not being aggressive. So it's very clear to them that there is a obvious aggressor. And I mean, if you see the list of American invasions and replacements of leaders in countries, the way they mingle into other people's businesses, basically, and lives, it's obvious. It's obvious, very obvious, who the aggressor is, and the Russians know this. And there's a difference with the Russians. First of all, of course, their army and their nuclear weapons.
Right,
they can defend themselves, and they will defend themselves.
Yeah.
Because they know that this is they had this before, basically. They have fought for their existence multiple times in history. This is something that we in the West don't really know in that sense. No one wants war in Russia.
Right.
They don't like war. They know it. For them, it's not a game.
Yeah.
For them, it's like a history of dying uncles and fathers and ancestors, and
Yeah.
So they carry that pain, like, very clearly. And it's in their culture. It's really
yeah. And their poetry and their arts, you see the sadness.
It's woven into everything, and and also they're very just about it. They know that they were in their right. In all these different situations in history, they were not given a choice. And the thing is, the more pressure you put on them, because they know that they are honest, they stand for truth. This is the main character trait of Russians, actually. They are brutally honest, I would say. There's no sparing of feelings. It's it's very straightforward.
It comes off cold. I know what you mean.
It comes off cold, but it's something that they culturally discovered over the millennia, I would say, in order to see. I was there once in a train in Moscow, or a metro actually, and there was an American dude sitting opposite a Russian, and they just stare you in the eye. These Russians, they just sit opposite you and they stare you in the face.
Jesus.
So really straight. The guy was looking like.
Yeah.
And the American dude looks him in the eye and becomes uncomfortable, and he makes a kind of he greets him. And this Russian dude doesn't do anything. He just keeps looking. And then the American guy became angry. And the Russian guy still didn't respond. Okay, he just kept looking him in the eye. And then at a certain moment, the American had his whole little drama going on. It's all internal, because the guy was just sitting there staring like all the others do, And then he stood up, the Russian dude. He greeted the American guy and he walked out. And I felt like, wow.
What a mindfuck.
And basically. But what was really shown was like the fakeness of the attitude of this American dude, because he greeted him, and straight after that he became angry. Well, nothing actually happened. Nothing in his external surroundings changed.
Right.
So they really look right through that attitude. And it's a common thing for them. So that's a very big difference, I found. And they're not gonna listen to fear, basically. They do what is right no matter what.
Right.
So they come. Like now Ukraine, they need to do it. There's no and they're not going to stop either, until it's done.
Well, can you speak a little bit to the LPR and the DPR region and what's been going on there over the past 8 years? Because I think that's also been a little bit, we don't get that perspective in the West very much either. Of, has the Ukrainian president and government been bombing these people in LPR and DPR, dramatically, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and it's this strange fight for independence in this region of Ukraine. I was kind of okay with just Putin, freeing that area, but now he's gone all of Ukraine, so I'm a little bit more perplexed. Like, okay, so then what's the bigger play here? Because just speak to a little bit of that history and those people, okay. and what do you think are the best solutions, honestly?
For the West, the best solution would be to keep out completely. Right. Don't bother. Don't do what they're doing now. They're sending all these messages, help Ukraine, blah blah blah, all these propaganda, because they try to justify the weapons that they're sending, and they try to arm the brainwashed Ukrainian people that are being brainwashed by the extremists that have been put into power by the CIA and the Obama administration.
And these are the specific neo-Nazi groups that you're referring to?
They call them neo-Nazis, yeah, but it has to do with Stefan Bander, and that's like he was on the side of the Nazis, and he actually committed genocide on the Polish ethnic Poles, because right. Ukraine is actually a kind of the borders of Ukraine do not correspond with the Ukrainian people, and so the Russians living in Ukraine, about 1/3 is Russian speaking, and about 1/5 is ethnically Russian. They already lived there before those borders were made. So when the Soviet Union was disbanded, they all of a sudden lived in another country.
Okay.
But they are Russian. So 25 million Russians are now outside of Russia. Also in the Baltics, this is the case. In some other countries, like Kazakhstan, and there's more of them. So basically, these weapons coming in, and also supposedly there were biolabs present in Ukraine, U.S. defense financed biolabs, like we know in Wuhan, and that's not, that's not what you want next door if you know their agenda and their aggression. So that was one target, and they were all weapons in so easily. They secured Chernobyl to prevent these extremists from blowing it up, probably. Jesus. Because they really don't give a fuck about the Ukrainian people at all. And they're just brainwashed to hate Russians. And this whole, there's a Western region where this Stefan Bander is presented like a hero. So these actually poor guys, are brainwashed from a young age, by their entire surroundings since the Second World War. So there is there's no sense of reality with them, I would say.
And the U.S. has a long history of doing the same thing all around the Middle East as well. I didn't want to cut off your flow, but it's interesting. I just saw this thing. Your sister, my wife, showed me this morning that Zelensky made a tough decision, and I haven't verified it, but made a tough decision to let prisoners out of prison to fight for the Ukrainian people. And there's also a lot of rhetoric about, like, is this going to go nuclear? The West keeps talking, just like even Zelensky himself said, Biden, you need to tamp down this war rhetoric. And then now the West is talking about, like, oh, Russia wants nuclear war. Russia wants nuclear war. So what's the guy's name?
They're talking no-fly zone.
Or
and they're saying no-fly zone, which is an act of war, which is crazy. I mean, no-fly zone equals armaments in Ukraine. That's World War III. Like, they even talk about that.
But I posted on Instagram.
But it will not be, none of that stuff will be respected by the Russians, They are already past talking. They have tried for 22 years. And now they need to act, and this is their region. It's like as if Mexico would be turned into a weapon against the United States. well, I hope for you guys that your army would prevent then what would inevitably follow by taking the initiative. So this is what they're doing, and they don't want people there to suffer. They're actually very angry about that, about this brainwash and the unnecessary suffering of Ukrainian people. And they express this openly, but nothing reaches us, like. So,
well, that's what's confused me is why doesn't Zelensky surrender? Like, honestly, save your citizens' lives. You're not going to win versus massively larger country and army. Like, everyone knows that. Just be honest with yourself. We're not going to, like, shame you, but just save the lives of people who are, just rational, exploited actors, everyday citizens of Ukraine who are still maybe fighting. Neo-Nazis are going to be neo-Nazis, but, like, as far as, like, why do you think he's trying to stand to the very last minute? I mean, they're outside Kiev. They just took the major second largest city. I'm blanking Kurdov, or I'm blanking on the name in the south, Kurdashev. But why doesn't he just surrender? I mean, like, does he honestly think he's going to win?
The story
like,
is not what the story is.
Yeah, it's very simple. Like he's an actor and he's being hired, and the only credentials he has is he was a stand-up comedian and actor. And he actually played in a movie where he became president, funnily enough. So it's one of those.
Didn't he write that? He wrote it.
I don't know if he wrote it himself, but he's not a real Ukrainian in that sense. He doesn't care about Ukrainians. He doesn't care at all. He wants to actually butcher as many of them as he can, I believe, because why else would you try to arm as many civilians as you can? Why would you put them up against this super professional army, like knowing that it's only gonna, make it worse, basically, like create more victims.
To give him a steelman argument, you could say that he's trying to get enough empathy from the West and Europe to get involved. I mean, that's the only, that's the best angle I can give him. Is like, I'm trying to get enough empathy to get a World War III started, basically. Like, nobody likes this in the West, but like you said, like the most rational, objective thing, like taking our emotions out of this, is just accepting that Russia is going to take Ukraine at this point and trying to have the least amount of violence and death at this point, and trying to then de-escalate any sort of nuclear tensions with Russia and Ukraine. I mean, Russia, for the future, they're a pariah. They're not going to have any economic, financial, like, they are going to be so cut off from the world. I feel for the Russian citizens. Do you think, like, they're okay with that? Like,
so by the way, everybody, we're going to, I know I already said it, but we're going to have Ruben as the first extended exclusive members podcast. So we're going to do the next hour at Ben Joseph Stewart. If you sign up to become a member, we're going to get into stuff that YouTube won't allow us to talk about today. So I'll just leave it there and Ruben, let you respond to what Gordo was saying. We'll leave the whole Zelensky Israeli thing till later.
Sure. Yeah. Well, to get basically NATO involved and start World War III, you said, right?
Well, I mean, that's the steelman argument, like to give him the benefit of the doubt, that to say he's acting in the best interests of his people. And, because he gives some impassioned speeches, my own family members. And I know a lot of people here really, people are really supporting him, behind him. If you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, like, is he honestly thinking this is going to get enough empathy to get NATO involved? Like, what's, is that his angle, basically? Like, why would you?
It's interesting. It's interesting how, like all these wars in Syria and in Kosovo, Serbia that was bombed by NATO, and all these other countless wars that NATO and the US started. And basically they left a mess and they let all sorts of extremist genies out of the bottle, mm-hmm. and they grew like the Mujahideen in the 80s that they supported against the Soviets. Osama bin Laden was with them, They took, with those weapons, they took Afghanistan. That became the Taliban. It's completely self-created. They create the pawns, the dualistic, polarized pawns with which they play the game. Yeah, and the game is divide and rule.
Yeah, and if you make umbrellas, you need terrain.
Yeah, Zelensky. I mean, it's a Jewish president with the neo-Nazi army. It's bizarre, and it's basically, it seems to be aimed at chaos. it's not benefiting Ukraine from the start on, because 80% of Ukraine's economy was dependent on Russia. When this coup d'etat in 2014 happened and they placed Poroshenko in that position, and that was obviously done by Obama and the US and the CIA and you name it. Mm-hmm. By the way, the Clintons and the Bidens have huge interests too in the resources in Ukraine, and that's already since 2008, I believe, what I found. And there's actually recorded calls between Biden and Poroshenko that can be found on the Rumble and BitChute, I believe. Mm. And there you can hear how they speak about Trump, for example. Mm. They call him a dog, the dog who caught the car, because dogs like to chase cars, and he caught the car, so he has no clue what he's holding on to and what the content is.
Right.
And they might be right about that, unfortunately. But it's a divide and rule, and now they're just destroying Ukraine, and I think they will plunder, or they probably already plundered their gold, and other resources since 2008. 2014, Poroshenko came. That's when these Eastern European parts, or Eastern Ukrainian parts, Donetsk and Lugansk were separated, and Crimea voted with 97% overwhelmingly to rejoin Russia. And by the way, in Crimea, there is the biggest Russian naval base. So this is also strategic that they need to keep that. But it says also a lot about their relations before with Ukraine, that their biggest naval base is there. And there were no problems ever. So Ukraine basically got tempted by NATO and by the West, I think, with just corrupt people in high places and lots of money, this is what you see all over Eastern Europe, like roads are being built, buildings are being built, corrupt people are becoming heroes, but actually all that new stuff just represents the debt that they are in. So it's an enslavement system. And since 2014, the shooting by the Ukrainian army on these eastern regions never stopped to bring us to this Minsk agreement thing. So it's the Ukrainian army that never held themselves to these agreements. And then the shooting increased massively just before this Russian invasion. So it's actually initiated by the Ukrainian army, this invasion. Because this is of course not something I can research so easily, but Putin and the Belarusian president tried to contact Zelensky, and they couldn't, because they wanted the shooting to stop, of course. And then Zelensky came out to the Western media shouting, like the vlogger he is, about how he couldn't reach Putin and how the Russians are attacking. So again, this is it's initiated by the Western side of this story, and the Russians just take care of business basically, and they're not going to stop. And also, there will be no Western intervention, I believe, directly, because they are not going to stop. Even then, they would not stop, because it's clear to them. It's clear. There's no other options than to secure this thing yourself. They can't count anymore on kind of the words of the lying other, that has been lying to them all along. So why would they listen?
Yeah.
It's sad. Trust is, there's no trust.
When talking about the U.S. side of things, so I've been covering for a while that Catherine Austin Fitts, who was in the Bush Senior's cabinet, said that since the late 90s, she knew something was up, and then she eventually heard it from somebody in the government that the U.S. is done. The 250th birthday is on 2026. Empires don't last, consistently nowadays don't last beyond 250 years. And that money is to be extracted from the U.S. and there has to be a forward-facing public, relations campaign to give it a spin. Why did the US end? Oh, it's a pandemic. Oh, it's all these other things. And, you know, what I'm kind of seeing about this is like, for me, all roads lead back to Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. Not to say he's the tippity top of the pyramid, but it is kind of interesting to see that when you were showing all those people in the Council on Foreign Relations and who dictates foreign policy mainly for the West, we're talking BlackRock.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Larry Fink. We're talking Blackstone. We're talking Vanguard. We're talking about the financial class that is rising up at a ridiculous
military-industrial complex too.
To bring us into some blockchain but still centralized trace and track surveillance state. And I'm curious, like Ruben, your thoughts on Russia's stance on where this whole gamified stakeholder capitalism, World Economic Forum push. Like, do you know anything about like their stance on how that's becoming a global phenomena? Is this kind of technocratic takeover by the financial class? Are you seeing anything from Russia that's seeing that writing on the wall?
Yeah, there's not that much that I know about what they said about it.
Okay.
But I do know that Putin, when Putin came to power in 2000, the oligarchs basically were running Russia. And the oligarchs now are not running Russia. They are in second place. So the capitalist influences, like the big multinational companies that in the West, know no boundaries. They do know boundaries in Russia. They do have to obey in a certain way. And they are not happy with the sanctions also, by the way, of course. And I believe that's the reason why Putin is keeping his distance. He's not afraid of COVID, like they say. I think he is securing himself against, enemies, domestic enemies, basically, because Russia is not fully secured in that sense. It's not like Putin is some kind of a dictatorial ruler who has all the power.
So you're saying assassination attempts, just to clarify, like because I've heard that COVID is the reason, but you're saying because there's actually enemies within, he'd be concerned about.
There's enemies within, yeah, and yes, that's what I'm talking about. And of course, this is speculation. I don't know. I haven't heard Putin say this himself, right. But for me, the logic adds up when you're like dealing with these kind of psychopaths,
right?
Which were, by the way, also financed from the West. Straight after the Soviet Union fell, they had all these shares for the people that worked in these massive factories and all that. So they would own the companies they worked in. But because these people were so unexperienced with any kind of capitalism, they didn't know what to do with these papers, and they didn't have food, so much. So they sold them to these oligarchs, and that came in with a lot of Western money and bought up all these massive state companies. That's how these guys came. So that again was a destabilization action from the West, coming in from the West. And I mean, when I say the West, of course, I don't mean the people, because we ain't got shit all to say, like nothing really. So that, I believe, is a very important realization, that the Russians actually have more freedom than we do in the West. And that there's a whole different narrative. Like, we need to look within. We need to really start connecting to our local communities and reconnecting ourselves to a sense of being, like divinity, I would say, a sense of self, which is rooted in unity. Like, this is the big misconception. Like you asked before, who are they? Well, they are the people that lost their sense of self and that fell into the game, the game of polarity. So it became competition and struggle instead of resonance. If we're conscious, if we're really unity conscious, we understand that matter matters. It's part of it. Nothing is excluded. So we need to take a stance. We need to take our place. We need to, prepare ourselves, become a homesteading people, grow our own foods. This is how Russia came out of the Soviet Union as well. They had something called dachas, which is 600 square meter, I believe, patches of land that the people can get and to grow their own food, to have their vegetable gardens. So they were not dependent anymore for their food on this tyrannical system. And this is one of the things that gave them the space, the breathing space to think and to stop this thing and to go against it, because ultimately it was an externally exposed system which sets up the people against their own intellectuals and their own leaders. That's what Marxism and communism does. Socialism, whatever we want to call it. It's a kind of, it's the thing that is in the minds of all these jealous people that have something against achievement, instead of looking within and seeing like, holy fuck, that I need to get my act together. It's not happening by itself. These vegetables don't grow by themselves, and this country is not returning to civilization, a real rooted culture. Nature is our hardware, and culture is software, basically, that can be replaced, but it needs to be aligned to the hardware, or else we fuck things up. We ruin the soil and the air, and and the body, the physical body, is representing that. Well, and then if you look at the United States and the West, but especially the United States and the Walmart people phenomena, it's sad. It's just a very sad state of being, like to be so sick and ill and weak and fat and or whatever, like all these pharmaceuticals, all these poisons, basically being mistaken for medicine, being mistaken for food. This is what should be really looked at. And I can promise you, I can guarantee you, if you go to Eastern Europe, people look much more healthy, generally. Like there's something more civilized there.
Yeah, dude, as we are wrapping up this hour, I love the fact, and somebody, Tori Scott in the chat just said, wow, beautifully expressed, true about unity and true individuality. This is really the core of what I've always found beautiful about the way you perceive what's happening in the world. I want to, because we talked a lot about like the physicality and kind of a lot of the base level understanding of what's happening now. I would love for you to dive deeper. And you mentioned, solution as far as like, community and growing food and getting back to like a real relationship with nature. I would love for you to maybe just spend a little bit more time. How do you see that happening? And what do you see as something that even for the people who, like, none of us in America, like very few of us, I should say, really have a clue of what it is we can do, even if we were educated enough to know something is just absolute BS about this narrative and this story. But a lot of people, they just have no idea what to do about it other than post on social media. I would love to hear your thoughts on what it is people can engage with that would really start reconnecting them back to source, back to that thing that we don't need external validation to drive our actions and our behaviors. I'd love to hear you speak on that.
Yeah, I think it starts I actually think it starts with a mental realization and acceptance of the situation, like the problem recognition. Like, okay, I'm lonely, I'm in pain, my body is sick. Like really to acknowledge like there is something going on, and then, well, knowledge does help. To know about the dopamine mechanism, for example, that we either receive the dopamine shot from consumption or creation. So if we lazily consume, if we are in this have ease as a value, instead of including the physical work in this dream of life and love, then we become lazy. We condition ourselves to to be passive, basically. So I believe we need to get off of things like Netflix, movies, mainstream news, the old media. We really need to get off, because this thing is not only confusing us by its content, it's also confusing us. And I do believe that is a much more powerful and deeper program by its impulses, just the sheer rate of impulses, and all these stories about faraway countries and other cultures and other this and all this other stuff, instead of coming to life where we are, getting to know our neighbors, looking what is actually happening in our surroundings. Like, are there homesteads of people we know, maybe, or are there farms, or we can learn about stuff, or can we play music together? Sharing circles are another thing that is really, really underestimated. Basically, this is the difference. This is the multipolar world. It's about being part of the circle. Putin says, I'll step into the circle. I'll speak to you as equals. We are reflections of each other, basically. We're equal. But yeah, the Western world thinks in pyramids and in discussion, not in sharing, but in discussing things. And we need to get out of that. We need to really allow each other to speak, to also bring in the shadows, to bring in the uncomfortable topics and feelings. So to bring the shadow to the light. We are the light. So the only way to grow is to draw that sort of reason, cut through that thorn bush of the shadow, and awaken this sleeping beauty inside. And by doing so, we experience the true flow, the true connection, which the lack of causes the whole hell on earth. When we put on a mask, when we start to believe that we are what we think we are, the image of self, other, world, when we're in the imagery, we fall in the metaphor, we start to act inauthentically. We start to play roles instead of expressing purely. And when we play those roles, the mask steals the attention. So that deeper, authentic inner child, as they call it, is not received because it's also not expressing. So there's this eternal hunger, and that's the drive of the beast. That's the drive of the diabolic machine. This is why glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost means transparency, and perestroika means reformation of the order system. To step back into the real natural order. From this transparency, order follows. So, and it energizes us also. If you have a good connection, you had, for example, something like a good dance with someone, or a good jam session. You're energized. The flow is on. You're inspired. You're creative. You sleep better. You're more satisfied. There's this kind of inner peace that cannot happen when we have a lack of connection. This is why we're God particles and we're not God itself. God is being, not a being. So religion is reconnection. It's literally what it means. Religare in Latin means reconnecting. So that's the only thing we need to do. And from that follows the rest, because then we will feel the love and feel the life, and we will start putting our health and happiness in a central place as our biggest value. And we will start giving to each other, because we experience this connection. We experience a sense of belonging. Our sense of contribution, our desire to contribute is also stimulated. So this is the only thing we need. We need those spaces. We need the Germanics or the Vikings called this, I believe, the ting. It was like a circle where they gathered, and everything was decided in that circle. And I believe all native peoples have this. And this is the essence. And also from there, we will bring forth representatives that will become our new leaders. So it won't be a top-down pyramid. It's a circle.
Council of Elders. Yeah, like the natives.
Yeah, like the only way that works,
Yeah.
I think the people are ready for more authenticity. I mean, you're seeing it with more and more people turning off on inauthentic TV and movies and turning more into authentic conversations online. And they're hungry for it because there's been such a lack of it. And hopefully that's a silver lining that can really come through all of this to help the West become more authentic with themselves and the rest of the world, and appreciate that about our Russian brothers and sisters. Because, yeah, I mean, the last thing we want is the rhetoric and the propaganda to win out and cause us to fight over, bullshit, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dude.
Yeah, they're ready, man. They're ready for peace. Like they will accept it instantly.
Yeah.
For sure. There won't be any grudges. There won't be anything like that. It's not in their nature.
Dude, this is beautiful. I think this is a good note to wrap this YouTube session on. Just so you know, Ruben, we got quite a few people saying just thank you very much for the way you laid it out right there, because it's as what we try to do in this program is speak about things in the language that we all understand, but like we have to bring it back down to what is most integral to the human experience. And I think you nailed it right there. And as much as, getting off some of, the legacy media is great, and hopping into, let's just say, more balanced, nuanced conversations is great. But I love the fact that you brought up ceremony and sharing circles, or ceremony, as some people say, because if you can be in person and sharing with one another, and Ruben, you and I have done some ceremony and been in a circle and shared, and oftentimes it's more powerful to hear people sharing than it is to go through the experience of a plant medicine. And that's because what we're really craving deeper beneath a plant medicine, opening us up to what we've been missing, is the thing that we've been missing, which is relationships with one another, real authentic relationships. And dude, I can't speak highly enough of the way that you see this and the way you speak very clearly to what we've talked about here. I'm super excited to hop this conversation over to benjosephstewart.com, where we're going to go deeper into the stuff that YouTube doesn't feel like humans are allowed to hear, because we're not ready yet, apparently, for these conversations. So we do believe that we're ready for these conversations, and that's why we're going to have the rest of this conversation over at benjosephstewart.com. I just want to, for the YouTube audience right now, Ruben, is there any last words that you want to say to the audience before we hop off?
Yeah, I just want to, well, the people that thank me, you're welcome, like from the heart, really. And I'm of course a Western guy, like you are, probably most listeners are, and yeah, we have something to do. But I feel very supported by the fact that this is what is happening with the Russians, and in a way, I see America. There's a kind of youthful energy in America that Europe is lacking, and I think it's because the grid here is so enormously old, and we're in this culture for so long. It's like the Roman Empire, but it was literally here 2,000 years ago, like colonizing my ancestors.
Yeah.
So I never felt Roman, and I always felt like a Germanic person, I would say. And there's a lot of wisdom also in the Viking mythology. As little as we know, there's a shitload of wisdom in that Ragnarok story, especially. And we're going to bring this whole beautiful American, Western competitive vibe and make it into a game. That's what I see happening. And the game is about growing healthy families and realizing that a child is the future. So we're raising the future. And let's do that together. And don't mind these fear-mongering BS stories too much, because there is no hostile Russian. And yeah, that brings us back to ourselves, I believe.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Beautiful. Well, beautiful. Dude, I really appreciate this. We still got a little bit more to go. I just saw on my phone a couple people joined the site. So just to let you know, If you want to sign up for the exclusive content, you go to Ben Joseph Stewart, the home page, and there is a button right there that you'll see. It says exclusive content. That's where you want to go for the rest of this conversation. And I plan on having, well, Ruben is actually going to be coming out here to the States, and we'll get some filming done in person. But there's going to expect a lot more of Ruben, not just on YouTube, but behind the paywall, for all of you who want to go deeper into these conversations. And as you see on the screen there, that's how you sign up. And as of right now, until this whole thing can be a gift model, this is how it's going to be done. But at some point, I really do feel like this putting stuff behind a paywall, I want to be very transparent about it, is not the most ideal, because some people, but it does show that you need to make some gesture that you want to go deeper into this conversation. And with that being said, deeper in the future, what I would like to have is actually a gift model once I figure out how this could actually even work on through Wix and through the back end, technologically speaking. But with that being said, I really do appreciate all of you who are supporting this work, and I'm really excited to get Ruben onto Wix in the exclusive content as the first voice other than mine, so it doesn't become too monotone and monotonous, as the first voice other than mine behind the paywall. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I really do appreciate you coming back every single week. The support, the chats, everything, even when we disagree, everybody is super mature, and I can tell beneath any tensions that might exist, all we're really looking for is something that makes more sense. That's what we're really looking, is to make more sense out of this roller coaster of ridiculous narratives that all of us in the West have fully understand for quite some time, that nobody in the US, except for a small pocket of super brainwashed people, really truly believes the narratives that come out of mainstream media here. We just don't even have the accessibility to get narratives outside of the norm. So we do our best to look at Russell Brand and maybe some of these others that are finally starting to bring very challenging narratives to the West. So with that being said, I love you. We're going to be over at benjosephstewart.com going even deeper on this conversation. I'll catch y'all next time on the Ben Stewart Podcast.